Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo developer evangelist. And our topic this time is dialog boxes and modal windows. Let's get started. So first, let's cover dialog boxes. So a dialog box is intended to present information to the user. And these are modal. So that means typically the rest of the app, or at the very least, a specific window, cannot be accessed until the dialog box is dismissed in some way. So yes, the dialog box must be dismissed. And there's a couple options for creating your own dialog boxes, displaying them. The first is the very simple MessageBox function, and then the more powerful MessageDialog class. So let's talk about MessageBox first. Well, first of all, and probably its most common use, a MessageBox can display some simple text in a button, something like this. Probably not super useful for most cases in your app, but it can be handy. I do see people use this a lot for some very simple debugging when they just want to quickly display a value and not have to drop into the debugger or show it elsewhere. And it can work for that. I wouldn't go too crazy and use message boxes throughout my app for testing or debugging purposes. That's kind of tedious to work through. And with messages or dialogues popping up all over the place, that can cause events to happen that you might not expect. So good for small amounts of use, but you don't want to use that heavily. MessageBox also has the ability to have up to 3 buttons with specific types of captions. So you can display a simple message box with captions like this. And there's a few different styles of captions that you can use. The buttons with a message box are not localized in any way, so you do want to keep that in mind. And frankly, the message box is a little confusing to use when you want to add buttons and then even maybe display a different icon or some other things, because you have to deal with numbers for each of the button styles that appear, and you have to add things together to come up with an actual integer value to pass into the message box function. So you're going to be constantly referring to the documentation on that to see what things are. And you don't have a lot of flexibility. You only get the built-in styles provided, and that's that. So generally speaking, for most of your dialog boxes that you want to display, you're not going to want to use MessageBox. For simple, quick things here or there, it might make sense, but for most things, you're going to want to avoid it. Instead, you're going to want to take a look at the MessageDialog class. This class also lets you have up to 3 buttons, but you have full control over everything. You can change the label text, the title, the message, all that you have full control over. And this can display as a sheet on Mac, which is really nice because then your dialog is specific to an individual window rather than your entire app. Here you can see a sheet that's sliding down from a window, and you can see the example of the dialog where it's got a specific description there and then some buttons that are nice and specific to the particular information that's being shown on the screen. And one thing to note about these buttons is they use the preferred action style. So, rather than those saying yes, no, or cancel, which requires you to actually have read and understand the text message above the buttons describe the actions very clearly. So the button says save or it says don't save. So even if you quickly glanced over the text above, you still know what's going to happen. And generally these days it is preferred that the buttons are done in this type of style rather than yes or no or something like that. Now let's talk a little bit about modal windows. And as you might guess, this is a window style that is modal, like a dialog is. So here you can see an example of a window that has appeared over another window, and it's modal. So that means that you can no longer access the window underneath until that modal window itself is dismissed or closed. And the benefit of this is, of course, that you have complete flexibility over what you want here. Since it's a regular window, you can put whatever controls you want on it, design it however you want, and it can be, any size you want, all that sort of good stuff. So there are a few options of window styles you can use when you're dealing with modal. There's a standard modal one. This style is just a modal window. You can't really move it around the screen or anything. And then there's a movable modal style, probably the most common style. This modal window will appear. It'll have a title bar. You can drag it around the screen to maybe move it out of the way if you want to see what's underneath. Even if you can't access what's underneath, sometimes you do want to be able to read it. And there's the sheet style on the Mac that I mentioned earlier that displays it essentially attached to its parent window. This is nice. It's commonly seen on the Mac. There is a downside to this, though, in that it's not movable. So if it ends up covering up something in the window underneath that the user might want to refer to, well, that's not good. That means the user is going to be annoyed. They can't see what's underneath. So in that case, even on the Mac, you might prefer a movable modal window. Windows and Linux kind of have a similar type of modal called modeless. It's not directly attached to the parent window like it is on Mac, but it functions as if it were. And essentially, to use this technique, you just design your window how you want. You pick one of those window styles. And then when you show the window, you use either show modal or show modal within for, in the case of sheet windows, to display it within a parent window. And here's a little tip we'll look at in a second when we look at some examples. You can actually put a timer on a modal window so that it can automatically close after a period of time. Obviously, you're not going to want to do this for all modal windows, but sometimes it can be handy. So let's switch over to Xojo here and take a look at a few examples. So here is, we'll start with MessageBox. So obviously, probably the simplest code you can write in Xojo, displaying a message box with just some text, and then when you run it, it'll have a single OK button. And then here is the more advanced style of message box that I was talking about. And this just to show you how you can set it up. Again, I really don't recommend this for most cases. I think you would want to use a MessageDialog. And you can see how setting this up is a little annoying because you have to have these integer values that refer to things. So here, 3, integer value 3 refers to yes, no, and cancel buttons. If I want to display the caution icon, I use integer value 48, and there's a variety of different options you have available here. They're all listed on the doc page from MessageBox. And then you can indicate which button's the default, again with another integer value. And then when you call the MessageBox function here, you have to add all those together, and then it ends up displaying what you want. And then you can pass in a title that it appears on Windows and Linux. It won't show here on the Mac. And then the result comes back as an integer, and then you can check the value to see which of the buttons was pressed. And again, the values don't really directly correspond to anything, so those are the sort of things you're going to have to look up in order to remember them. So if I run this, obviously you can see this one, pretty standard stuff, and this is what this one looks like. And then depending on what button you clicked, it displays there. So that's MessageBox. Let's jump here to this example here, which is going to show a MessageDialog. And let's see how that's set up. So because this is a class, you have to create an instance of it. So you do new MessageDialog. And then there are a variety of properties that you set depending on what you want. So you can set the message. You can determine what the action button is, what the cancel button is, and whether there's an alternative button as well. And you can specifically set their captions however you want. If you wanted all this stuff localized, you would just use dynamic localized constants. You can make visible the alternate ones and the cancel ones. By default, just the standard action one is visible. So you just set all that up however you want. It's nice and clear. There's no arcane index value, integer values to have to remember. It's just properties that you can easily grab via autocomplete. And then there's a corresponding class along with MessageDialog called MessageDialog button that will tell you which button was actually clicked in the dialog. And then here you call the show modal within, in this case, method, which will display this MessageDialog as a sheet within the parent window. And then you can just do a select case on the result. And then you check which button it is. So is it the action button? All right, well then you can do whatever the action is for that button. So in this case, we've set the action button to be saved. So this could call code to do the save. If it's the alternate action button, which we've configured to be don't save, you could, just do a regular cancel or whatever, or put the user back where they were. And then if it's a cancel, same sort of thing. So you can easily check which button was clicked, and it's much more readable than checking just, again, integer values that don't directly correspond to buttons. So when you run this, you can see it displays as a sheet there. It's attached to the parent window. And then whatever you happen to click, just being displayed here. And that's how MessageDialog works. It's pretty easy to set up. It's obviously more lines of code than using a very simple MessageBox, which is often just one line of code. But even if it's a bit more lines of code than the more advanced MessageBox syntax, I think it's more readable code and is worth doing. You can also see here an example of a modal window. We'll look at a couple others as well. And this modal window, when I click the button here, pops up. And I can't go back and click on this window. It's beeping at me right now. You're not going to be able to hear the beep, but you can see I can't select it or anything because this window is up. And because it's a modal window, I can design it however I want. So here I have a list box, and then I just get a button to select the name. And I can pick something and choose it, and clicking the button closes the window, and then I'm now back in the parent window where I can access it again. What does that look like? Well, you can see this is the window. It's just a regular window that's been added to the project, and the type here has been changed. So this one's a movable modal. I just have a simple list box with some values in here. And then in the action event for the button, I just grab whichever item in the list box happens to be selected and set it to a property on here. And then I tell the modal window to close. So that's how that window works. And then to use it, you just create a new instance, tell it to show as modal. And then in this case, I'm grabbing the property value and assigning it to a label that's on the parent window so that we can see what was clicked. But of course, you can do whatever you need to do there. So usage on this is also very, very simple. And like I said, you can design a modal window however you want to serve the needs of your app. And speaking of which, here is an example of a modal window that's designed kind of like just a generic input window. So if I run this, you can see what it does. You can set some text here that'll be used as the prompt for the input window, and it just quickly displays something here. And then tells you what was clicked. So that's an example, kind of a reusable input window here. So you can see, very simple layout. It'll just replace whatever you pass in for the prompt text here in this label. The OK button will be enabled when you actually type some text in it. And you can call it with syntax like this. So it's just a quick way to get some input from the user. You just call the input window and you call the show prompt method and pass in what you want for a prompt. And it'll return the value that you can then do something with. Show prompt is a shared method that creates an instance and does all the setup for you. And then there's a little bit of code back here on cancel and input field to enable a button, and then on the OK button to grab what was typed. All right, and the last example here is another modal window. And this one is going to prompt you to choose a few team names. And you see what I've done here is I put a timer on it. See, it's counting down. When it gets down to 0, the modal window is going to close automatically. So I didn't click anything there. Just put a timer to close that modal window if the user didn't make a selection. Obviously, this isn't the best user interface in the world. It kind of is like, oh, hurry up, rush, pick something before the timer runs out. Maybe a game. Here, I think I need to pick 3, the way this is set up. So how is that structured? Well, first of all, the parent window, nothing too fancy here. It is just has a for loop to loop 3 times, and then it'll display the modal window each time. And then if a team is selected, it's going to add it to that text area. That's all that's doing. But the window itself, again, looks very similar to the other modal windows. It'll have an OK button that will let you go to the right method, check what was selected, and then add it to the property, and then close itself. But in this case, I did move the code here into a method so that the list can call that on the double click. So this allows a double click of a row in the list box to also close the modal window. A little better user experience there. And then the timer, here there's just a timer. It's set to run about once a second. And then each time it runs, it's just grabbing that label with the countdown number and decreasing it. And then eventually when it reaches 0, it closes itself. So as you can see, having the modal window do that isn't really hard. But it's just something to keep in mind. There may be situations where it makes sense for your app to not leave the modal window up the entire time. All right, let's see here. I have a couple questions, so I'm going to just check those real quick. All right, Bo is asking if there's a way to make a blank window with modal properties. A blank window with modal properties. I want to have an app for a touchscreen Raspberry Pi and don't want to have the title bar, close button, etc. There are a few other Windows styles that might serve that purpose. If you look at this type of property here of a window, I'm pretty sure Modal Dialog is still going to have some buttons at the top, but maybe Plain Box might be the one I'm thinking of that it doesn't have that stuff. So you could use that one and display it modal. You'd have to test those on the Pi because some of these unusual window types aren't necessarily really supported on some operating systems. And that changes all the time as new versions of operating systems come out. So I don't exactly know how it might behave on a Raspberry Pi, but you want to try that and see. But typically for a kiosk app, or a kiosk app, I guess how you might say that, there are often OS APIs you can call to essentially tell the app that it's running in that mode. And then it disables lots of system menus and things like Alt-Tab and stuff like that. So that might be an even better way to make sure that no one can essentially exit your app without you letting them. All right, Edwin's asking about opening essentially a series of modal windows. So open a modal window or a modal dialog from a modal dialog. And he's asking if that's something that's good or something that should be avoided. And yes and no. I probably would avoid that. Users tend to find that pretty confusing when lots of modal dialogs appear and end up stacked one on top of each other, because then you can lose track of which one is the topmost, maybe. But I don't think it makes for the greatest user interface experience. I believe that does work, however. You can open up a modal from another modal, and it just appears on top of the modal. But much like with some of those non-standard window types, operating system support on that could vary or change over time. So, I mean, even though if it does work, that's probably something I would avoid unless I really had no choice. All right. Well, it's 2019 and February now. And that means the Xojo Developer Conference is coming up soon. And this year, it's May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in Miami, Florida, where it'll be sunny, warm, and gorgeous because the hotel, as you can see here, is right on the water. The conference actually is held at the Marriott that you can see there on the left. You can head over to xojo.com/XDC to check out more. If you register by February 22nd, you can save $200. And we recently posted the session schedule at that link above, so you can see all the sessions that are available and who's presenting. There's over 30 at this point. Lots of sessions, lots of new topics. So definitely check that out. Flights to Miami are usually pretty inexpensive, especially in the spring. So we'd love to see you at the Xojo Developer Conference. All right, well, as usual, you can always reach me, paul@xojo.com. That's email, of course. And on Twitter, I am @Lefevre. And I want to remind you to grab and try out the latest version of Xojo at xojo.com/download. The current version is 2018 release 4. And it's always great to grab the latest version, read the release notes, try your projects in it, check out what new features are added, what changes have been made, and see if there's stuff you can take advantage of to make your projects and apps even better. All right, I think that about wraps it up for this time. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.